Madam Chairman, all members are present and counted for.
Thank you, sir. Today we have with us Robert Wilkinson and Pat Flood. Both are known to us. Pat Flood, as of May 2020, was appointed Senior Advisor in TDEC's Bureau of Environment. In this role, he manages several programs, including TDEC's oversight of TVA's coal combustion residual effort. He also has technical responsibilities, including working on, and please, if I didn't pronounce this incorrectly, CERCLA efforts at the DOE's Oak Ridge Reservation. In addition, he serves as the Commissioner's designee on the Underground Storage Tank and Solid Waste Disposal Control Board. Prior to moving to the Bureau of Environment, he served 8 years as Director of TDEC's Division of Solid Waste Management. Prior to joining TDEC, he worked as a consultant in the solid waste industry, mainly in the fields of engineering and construction oversight. He received a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the Illinois Institute of Technology in 1982, a master's degree of civil engineering specializing in geotechnical engineering from Purdue University in 1986, and received a master's in business administration from Clemson University in 2001. He has been registered engineer in 14 states and also sits on the Professional Engineers Civil Exam Committee for the National Council of Examiners for Engineers and Surveyors. Mayor, would you like to introduce Mr. Wilkinson to the committee?
I'll let Pat do that.
All right, very good then.
Well, I think Robert probably does the best job. I don't have a written bio for him. So, Mr. Wilkinson, if I could trouble you to give us a thumbnail sketch and let these folks know how well qualified you are to be giving this presentation tonight, that'd be great.
Sure, absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Robert Wilkinson. As Commissioner Denenberg mentioned, this is not my first time here to speak to y'all. I have been the CCR Technical Manager for TDEC since 2017. So going on 6 years now. I've been working strictly on TVA's coal ash sites here in Tennessee, which includes Bull Run here in Anderson County. Prior to my time with TDEC, I was a private consultant for about 15 years, specializing in environmental assessment, remediation, hazardous materials, and geologic studies. I am a registered geologist here in Tennessee as well as New York, and I'm also a certified hazardous materials manager. I worked a little while before I became a consultant for the state of Texas, for the Texas Engineering Experiment Station, doing surface water quality work in the late 90s, early 2000s. I have a bachelor's degree in geology from Texas A&M University Kingsville, and I've been the primary point of contact on the Commissioner's Order investigation process with TVA at TDEC, as I said, since 2017.
Thank you very much. My understanding that you're going to be here to give us an update or rundown on what's going on, and so please go ahead.
Absolutely. We've got a few slides put together just to kind of give an update overall on the status of the Bull Run investigation and where we are in the process, and then of course available to answer any questions at the end of it. And we also have hard copies of the slides that we'll hand out after the presentation, so y'all can keep those for reference moving forward. We'll go over a short background for those that may not be familiar with the Commissioner Order process and what we've been doing with TVA and specifically here at Bull Run. Give you an update on the schedule of activities and then what we've got to complete here at Bull Run with the investigation. We are working under what we call a Commissioner's Order, which is a administrative order that was issued by the department in 2015. And what it did is establish a comprehensive process for us to go in and investigate, assess, and remediate any unacceptable risks resulting from the management of coal combustion residuals, or CCR, at TVA facilities here in Tennessee. Another purpose of the order was to allow TDEC to coordinate the implementation of the federal CCR rule here in Tennessee to ensure compliance with our laws and regulations as TVA works with their coal ash here in Tennessee.
Excuse me,
Yes.
do you have handouts of these?
Yes, sir.
Could we have them so we can make notes on them as we go, please?
Absolutely.
I'll get Pat a second here.
Yeah, it's okay if I just walk around.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Hate to come all the time doing
And
stuff.
Pat probably wouldn't have anything to do with that.
Thank you. Never thought about taking notes, that's really a good point. Thanks for pointing out the obvious too.
Thank you.
So the primary elements of the Commissioner's order are three phases, what we call the investigation, the assessment, and the remediation phase. The investigation phase is where TVA developed an environmental investigation plan for each site that when we implement it, it would be fully characterizing any impacts to groundwater, surface water, soil, or any other media that may have impacts from CCR in the area. The next step in the process is the assessment, and this is the environmental assessment report that is prepared by TVA and submitted to TDEC for review. And it's an analysis of the extent of soil, groundwater, and surface water contamination by CCR at each site. The final stage of the process is the corrective action risk assessment plan, and that is a plan that will be put together under TDEC oversight that will specify the action that TVA is going to take to remediate any impacts to the environment from the management of CCR.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Do you anticipate any problems within these areas?
Well, as of right now, we have finished up the investigation phase, and TVA is going to be submitting the environmental assessment report to us next month, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation here. And as of right now, the biggest process is once that report is submitted to TDEC, we have to review every single line, every single data point that was generated, and determine if TVA has made a correct assessment of the site. They don't get to just give us the assessment and say, this is what the site looks like. TDEC actually spends time with our expert hydrogeologists, our engineers, our geologists, our folks to determine if they have properly characterized and assessed the site. Now I can tell you we've gone through this. This is not the first EAR we're getting. This is about the third in the process. And we've had comments on the previous EARs that we've seen for some of the other sites here in Tennessee. And the comments are always well received by TVA. Of course, they're technical in nature. They require us to meet with TVA and discuss them and figure out how we're going to make the corrections to the report. So it's not really that we run into any difficulties that are where we're conflicting with each other potentially on our understanding of the site. It's mostly how we interpret the data that we've received and how we establish how we're going to move forward in the process. The assessment is key for the corrective action. If we haven't properly assessed the site, we're not going to be able to make the right corrective action decision, right? We're not going to be able to make the decision that's going to help us figure out how to clean up the impacts. And so we do see that there are some pinch points and some bottlenecks in the process when we're reviewing these and going back and forth with TVA a little bit. But we have not seen anything where we've just hit a brick wall and not being able to come up with a solution or a way to move forward in the assessment phase.
Very good, thank you.
So as I said, we do have an updated schedule. The last time we talked to y'all, I think it was in 2021, is the last time we were able to speak in front of the commission. And at that time, we are anticipating getting a EAR in February of 2022. As I said, we're now going to be getting that EAR in March of 2023. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that led to the delay in the schedule here in the next few slides. But as an overall process, once we receive the EAR from TVA, we'll review and provide comments back to TVA on the document, and there will be revisions that are required. We will also be doing a step in between the first submittal and the second submittal where we go out and complete our water use survey here in Louisville. We have completed a tabletop survey and identified potential receptors in the area and wells that would need to be sampled.
You may need to explain water use survey.
Yeah, and I think I do in the next slide, but I can go ahead and cover it right now. As part of the EAR, we asked TVA to identify any potential wells or public water sources in the area that would maybe impacted by CCR and were required to be sampled. These include private residential wells and things like that for private consumption. TVA has gone through the process of identifying potential wells, going through databases, record search, etc. And they are providing that list to us in the first revision of the EAR. We will assess and make sure that TVA has identified all of the potential wells that may need to be sampled, and then we will direct TVA to engage the public in the sampling process of those wells. And that will occur, and that data will be incorporated into the next revision of the EAR. Once we complete the EAR process, which I can tell you is at least one iteration of revisions, possibly multiple, depending on what type of back and forth we have with TVA. Once we complete that process and TDEC is confident that the site has been properly characterized and assessed, we will move into the corrective action phase. And the corrective action phase is right now sometime in between, excuse me, that should be April 2024. I apologize. That's in April 2023. That's a mislabel on that, if y'all will correct that. Sometime between April 2024 and November 2024, we should be in the process of getting public input on our CARA plan. We anticipate getting the first submittal in October of this year, if everything goes well with the EAR revision process. And again, that will be a plan that is reviewed by TDEC, that is commented on and revised until we get to the point where we are confident that we have made the corrective action decision at the site. And corrective action means how we're going to close the units, what the ultimate disposition of the CCR material is going to be, and also what type of treatment is going to be required to deal with any groundwater, surface water, or contamination issues that we have at the site. That is all within the CARA, what we call the corrective action or CARA process. And there is public involvement in that, as we say on the slide. Once we have approved the CARA plan in its form, it will go out for public comment. We will review the public comments and we will address those comments in another revision to the plan once the public comment period is completed. So that is a big step in the process, is getting the public involved in what the ultimate decision is at the site. Yeah.
What was the date you said need to be corrected?
Yeah.
It says April 2023. I apologize. That should be April 2024.
On the third bullet there, is what you're saying? April?
Yeah, under the CARA plan public comment period. I apologize. I did not catch that. I had 2023 instead of 2024.
So the next bullet, would it also be changed to 24, or is it August 23 to 25?
Yes, that would be a 24 as well.
Thank you.
Good catch.
Shame on your reviewer.
I know. Shame on my reviewer for not catching that. I blame my editor.
Do we assume then that the other dates are correct?
Yes, they are correct.
Okay.
I just had I had 2020. I don't know about y'all, but I've been really practicing hard to make sure I write 2023 on checks and everything else this time of year. I apologize. It was a slip of the mind there.
That's fine.
All right. So as I've said, we've completed the EIP investigation activities at the site, which included both The original phase 1 investigation activities? Yes.
Would you be so kind as to tell us what the EIP?
Sure. That stands for the Environmental Investigation Plan. And that,
Back up and go over the 3 steps again.
sure. And that would be step 1, that we require TVA to develop an EIP, Environmental Investigation Plan. Now that process was quite a bit of work as well that required, we had a public comment period on that plan as well before we accepted it as a final EIP. So we have continued to move through that process. But we have now, once we had a workable plan, implemented it, we've completed that phase of the process.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to keep interrupting you, Robert, but I think if you just thought of it as 3 buckets, I think that would be helpful to organize your thinking. The first bucket, which you've already moved away from, killing me here, is the...
Pat, do you mind if you go to
Oh.
the microphone? It's going to be recorded for TV.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Yeah, and I'll apologize on the record for interrupting Robert again. I'll try to stop doing that. But if you think of this in terms of 3 buckets, I think that is helpful to conceptualize what we're doing. First bucket is investigation. You go out and you collect data, and these are big, complicated sites, so you collect a lot of data. And then once you have the data, and let me back up a little bit, sometimes you actually have to go out and collect more data. And I think Robert will talk about that, because as you collect data, you realize this either isn't the right data, or I've got holes in my data, and I've got to fill this gap, or this data is not what I was expecting it to be, so we've got to collect additional data to help understand what the site is like. Because as Robert pointed out, if you don't collect all the data you need, if you don't understand what's happening at the site, if you don't know what the problem is, you're not going to be able to come up with an effective solution. So investigation, and the second step is the assessment, where you take the data and you kind of look through it, and you do some engineering evaluations, some remedial evaluations, things like that, to try to figure out what the game plan looks like. And that's the document that we're going to be receiving shortly. And then once that assessment is performed and we agree with that assessment, which I'm going to guess it right out of the gate, we're not going to necessarily agree with everything that's proposed. So we're going to make them go back and say, you need to look at this, you need to look at that, have you thought about this and that? So that in of itself is, a pretty extensive effort. And then once that's done, once you've got all the data that you need to understand the problem, once you've evaluated the problem and you've figured out what the solution looks like, then you do the corrective action, which is where you go out and you start fixing or correcting the problem. And that's what you're going to see as part of the CARA. Basically, the thing to take away is corrective action, which is the CA in CARA. So, I'm so sorry, I know we didn't get to all this, but I just felt that was important. So questions on that? Robert can answer before we move on. But I think it's really important to understand we're looking at 3 buckets here, 3 parts of the process.
Good, thank you.
Pat, you can occupy that chair right there, so I have a microphone if you
Right
want.
there.
So, as Pat said, we had completed the EIP process, that first bucket. But during that first phase of the investigation, we identified some areas that required additional data collection before we could move on to the EAR phase of the process, that second bucket. First off, we realized that in order to do a better job of characterizing the hydrogeology at the site, we needed to do what we call surface geophysics, which means we needed to do some geophysical assessments of the site to determine what potential flow pathways for groundwater, where our water-bearing units were exactly, and the best place for us to install some of these monitoring points at the site. So we added that in 2019. As a reference, the EIP was approved in 2018. We started the investigation process shortly thereafter. But in 2019, we realized as we were out there drilling that we were sometimes not exactly where we needed to be when we were drilling these borings of these wells. So we went back to TVA, identified these areas where we needed to do some surface geophysics to help us better target and identify these areas where we wanted to collect these samples. And we did that in 2019. We also had, during the process, to do some supplemental stream sampling, particularly in Worthington Branch at the site. Worthington Branch is the small creek branch that kind of runs almost through the middle of the facility there. It's right there as it feeds into to the clinch. We identified that we needed some additional sampling of the benthic community there, and when we talk about the benthic community, that's doing the sediment sampling from the bottom of the creek and from the side banks of the creek, where what I call the bugs live in there, the macroinvertebrates, the little critters that live down in the sediment. We realized we needed to do a more refined sampling set on that area, so we added some sample locations and additional rounds of sampling. One of the complicated things with sampling streams is you're kind of wanting to capture 2 different times of the year. You want to capture when the water level's really low, because you want to see what the conditions are when we have low water. That's usually in the wintertime. And then we want to look at summer, what we call summer pool levels, where the water levels are a little higher, and we want to be able to capture both of those. So when we changed the additional sampling at Worthington Branch, we kicked it out to where, well, we've got to go capture another round of winter sampling, then we've got to capture another round of summer sampling, and it really extended our sampling schedule for the surface water. In fact, it ran between almost 2 years, 2020 and 2022. We were still sampling in 2022 to make sure we captured all the information we needed to from Worthington Branch. And that was, when we put the EIP together, it was our best understanding of how we could go out and collect this data. Best laid plans when you get into the field are always, changed, and when you encounter the actual conditions. And so with Worthington Branch, we realized we needed to put a little more effort, collect additional samples, and further delineate that.
What was it that made you think that?
Well, we did see in some of our original samples that we had some detections of CCR material in Worthington Branch. And we always said that if we saw that we had CCR material anywhere, we would go back and do some additional sampling, and that's what we did. The next one that we came across was for our background soil sampling. Our background soil sampling program was intended to determine what type of constituents would be naturally occurring in the soil in the absence of CCR management. If there were no coal ash ponds there and Bull Run hadn't been there, what would the natural native soil constituents look like? So we'd have an understanding of where we needed to be identifying areas of concern. Well, as we did that, we realized that one of the components we needed to look at were some of the native rock outcroppings in the area to understand what the components of those materials were. And specifically, we were looking for what we call geochemical characteristics. We are starting to learn as we go through this process at all these TVA sites that one of the big driving factors of whether you have contamination and what type of contamination you have, specifically in groundwater, has a lot to do with what type of soil and what type of rock exists in the area. And without getting too down in the weeds about geochemistry, what it's saying is as the water flows through the rock and the soil, any chemicals that are in that, whether they're naturally occurring or they're what we call anthropogenic or they're not naturally occurring elements, when it interacts with the rock and the soil, sometimes it gets absorbed to it. Sometimes it releases other things from the soil that may have what we call kind of tag-along type things. So we started to realize that if we really want to understand how the mechanisms are of these CCR constituents getting into the environment, we have to have a much better understanding of what the soil type and the geochemistry properties of those are. So we initiated this additional study in 2021 to do that, so we would have that data as part of the assessment. And that one really is something we learned as we started installing the borings, looking at the data, looking at the groundwater data, realizing, and we took samples from within these CCR units, and we looked at the water, what they call the pore water, the water that's inside the units, looked at its chemistry, and it looked quite a bit different than what we were seeing outside the unit. So we were trying to determine and understand what that mechanism is that changes the water chemistry. And what we really use that data for is not only to assess the site, but when we determine what the corrective action is, how we're going to clean up the groundwater, we have to understand that mechanism to design our treatment.
What did you find different about the comparisons?
Well, sometimes we would see very low concentrations of things like arsenic and cobalt in the pore water, and we would see higher concentrations of that particular chemical concern in the groundwater. So we were trying to figure out what changes between those two.
Thank you.
And as I said, to have an understanding if we're going to address the issues in groundwater and design an effective treatment system in that phase of the process, we have to know that geochemical process that goes across there. We also had to do quite a bit of work on what we call the supplemental seismic stability evaluation. One of the things we were really looking at these units is how stable they are. In other words, you know, in their current state, the way they are constructed, the way they are placed, the way the material currently sits, how stable is that from an engineering standpoint? And Pat can talk to a lot better about this than I can. He's our stability expert. But what we determined is we went out and we evaluated what historical data. TVA has done a lot of data collection at the site for geotechnical. As y'all know, after the Kingston spill, they were required by EPA to go out and do a geotechnical evaluation of all of their units. So they collected a lot of data. We looked at that. We determined areas where we needed to, our best, thoughts on where we collect additional data in the first phase of the environmental investigation. Went out and did that. Ran the analysis, realized we had some areas that needed more data to support the analysis of the stability. And when we say stability analysis, it's a computer model that's run to determine, number one, we have two phases. We have static stability, i.e., how does this stuff act just as it sits right, without any outside forces acting upon it other than, the standard things we have. Then we have what's seismic ability, and that's when we evaluate if we were to have an earth-moving event, an earthquake event, how would this material react when it's shaken, basically, when it's hit with seismic activity. So we determined that we needed to get some more borings out there, some more geotechnical borings, do some more what we call cone penetration test, which is a rig that goes out there and pushes in the ground and tests the strength, correct, of the unit?
Well, tip and sleep, complicated, but yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to make Pat's much better at this than I am for this kind of stuff. But what we wanted to do is do a better understanding of the material characteristics, of the geology, of the CCR material itself, of the dikes that are constructed around it, all that information, of the subsurface rock in the area to understand how that material was characterized. So we needed more data in order to do the stability analysis. And we did that, and it took us quite a bit of time to go out there and get that additional data and run that additional analysis. And it also took quite a bit of time between our engineers and TVA's engineers looking at the analysis and what does the analysis mean? Do we agree with the data they use? Do we disagree with the data they use? Do we need to use better data? It was quite a long process to get through the stability evaluation. We actually used our expert engineers here at TDEC. We used subcontract engineers that are experts in the field of stability to make sure we evaluated this correctly. And it led to more data collection, and it led to a better assessment of the site, which will be incorporated into the So that kind of brings us up to date of where we are in the investigation activities that are completed. It should be noted that what we didn't discuss today is all the groundwater sampling that we've done and we've continued to do at the site as part of the evaluation process. We are continuing to do that. TVA is continuing to sample in the interim as we go through the evaluation process. We have not stopped collecting groundwater data at Bull Run. We have, not necessarily directed, but TVA agreed, let's put it that way, to continue to sample the wells that we did as part of this investigation while we evaluate everything, so we continue to get updated data through the process on the groundwater. So we have the first EAR going to be submitted to us next month. They have till March 27th to submit it to us. history teaching me I'll get it on March 27th. And then we will go through the EAR review process here at TDEC, where we will spend sometimes 60 to 90 days reviewing the report, going through every line, going through every paragraph and every attachment as we determine if they've made an accurate assessment. We collect our comments. We have our engineers, our geologists, our biologists. We have subcontract experts in the field of, as I said, stability. We have toxicologists and specialized stream folks that help us take a look at the surface stream and benthic data as well. And that takes quite a while to go through that process and review the report. Then we submit those comments to TVA for them to revise the report based on our comments. In that if we are in agreement on the water use survey side, if we've agreed that TVA has identified the wells that we need to be targeting for that, we will give them an approval to move forward with their water use survey while they're addressing our comments on the rest of the report. And that process will be started. If we have any issues with that, there may be a delay in that. I will say that Cumberland, we've done the water use survey process at. We gave TVA the approval and they went out and did it, and it was a very successful water use survey process. So we're anticipating having the same thing here. This will not be our first water use survey. Thankfully, y'all aren't the first ones. Well, the first one was Cumberland, but it went very, very well. So we're looking forward to that. And as I said, that will be completed in between what we call Rev 0, which is the first version of the EAR we get, and Rev 1, which addresses our first round of comments. Once we complete that process, and there will be back and forth between us and TVA until we have finally accepted the EAR. And once we do what we call the final acceptance, we will send TVA a letter that says, you know, we agree with what the findings of the EAR. We're ready to move to the next phase of the process, which is the corrective action phase. And at that time, I believe the order gives TVA 60 days from that letter to get us a corrective action plan for the site. And as I said, that triggers the final bucket of the final phase of the process, which is corrective action. As I said, we continue to have TVA sample the wells, even the wells that are not part of their state, permit programs that they have out there that they have to sample anyway. They're sampling all of the wells we install as part of the EAR process and the EIP. And we continue to evaluate that data. TVA continues to submit it to us as we go through the process, and we will incorporate all that additional data into the CARE phase, into the corrective action phase.
All right. Not everyone sitting up here, and we have the chair of the commission came in while you were speaking. He's sitting back there behind Mayor Frank. But I'm going to open this up for comments from anyone from the commission that would like to ask questions. Since you've been sitting here, I figured you might, Bob.
I'd like to ask, are there any significant problems that you see in meeting the schedule that you've laid out? Or are there things out there that could change that schedule? And I say that because I think people are anxious to get an answer on some of these things and know where we're going.
I completely understand that. And I think the real time constraint is how long it takes us to review the process, to review the report. I go back to something I was told when I was in college. The professor always told me that the amount of time I have to spend reviewing your product is based on the quality of the product. If it's a good quality product that is something we don't have to spend a lot of time on, then we can shorten it down. But to be honest, it's the first one we received was around 1,200 pages with appendices and everything else and diagrams. And just to be able to go through that, even if you're not the expert in every area, but review that report and provide a good technical review is a lengthy process. I've tried to incorporate that the best I can into the schedule that I've provided of when we think we're going to have that. I kind of gave windows of time because of that functionality or how much time we may spend on it. And when we give TVA our comments, how good they are at responding to those comments, right? Sometimes we have to meet with them in the interim because they may have an idea of how they're going to respond to those comments. We may tell them that's not a good way to respond to that particular comment, go back to the drawing board, do a better job. Or we may say, yes, absolutely, you're on the right path, continue down that path. We don't just wait for them to send us a response back. We stay very active in the response phase to make sure that we limit as much as we can on the review process. But it is really a function of the time and that we have available to review it. And we do our best to limit it to that 60 to 90 day window to get through an EAR. And I don't think we've had any problem meeting that so far, but we're in the middle of, right now I have a couple of EARs on my desk and I'm waiting on this to be the third one coming in. So it does put a lot of time and effort into reviewing it, and that can extend the schedule.
Yeah, and is this working?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so I just want to chime in because I think your question is, what do you not know that you think might run the schedule out a lot further? And I would just like to make the point that the thing, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Robert, the thing that really tends to extend the schedule out is if you have to go back into the field and collect more data. Because usually there's contracts involved with that, and that's just kind of a long, extensive sort of thing to do in the field. I would like to think at this point that there will be limited to no additional trips back out to the field. So we have, I think, limited how long this can go. Now, it is likely that we're going to have them do reanalysis, but they've got the data to do that reanalysis. So there may be some iterations on that, but I would expect the iterations on reanalysis to be shorter than the iterations associated with going back out and collecting 2 seasons worth of benthic data to see whether the materials that are uptaking are natural or from the CCR. So I think in that regard, we've limited. I don't see us going back out to the field for big data collection exercises. So something could come up, and I will bet my last dollar that there'll be iterations where they submit something that we are not on board with and they've got to redo it, but not like going out and collecting more field data. Is there an answer in there?
Yes. Thanks.
I got a question.
Yes, sir.
Will there be a report out showing the results of your test around these wells?
That will be included in the EAR report that we get in March. That data will all be there.
Will it be publicly available?
TVA has been posting the EARs on their website. I think we have the website up for Bull Run right here. When they submit them to us, they have been posting those EARs on their website. And of course, you can always reach out to TDEC and we can provide a copy. They are big documents, it's usually 30 to 40 megs in size. So it's a little hard to email them, but we can always put them on a download site and things like that. So it is publicly available.
Yeah, and something else I'd like to chime in on. These, as Robert said, are just enormous documents, and you are welcome to read them all you would like, but if you would like for us to come in and summarize them for you so that they can kind of boil it down to something a little more comprehensible, that'll be in that, we are happy to do that as well.
I know that I have had problems on my own in accessing what I was looking for on the the other website.
Yeah. Well, we're working to that. It has gotten a little bit better on that, and we are trying in the process too on TDEC of getting these posted through our website as available. But as I said, they're really big documents. They take up a lot of space on the servers, and so we also have some limited issues on our side of being able to do that.
Thank you for that. Tracy?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Robert, thanks for the presentation. I was looking at the EIP plan for Bull Run. It says revision 4. You say there's 2 additional investigations. So is the EIP finalized then?
Yes, Yeah, it's been, there were some supplemental plans that were submitted after EIP Rev 4 to address some of those additional data collection efforts. But at this time, we've completed all of the activities that were outlined in EIP Rev 4 and the supplemental investigation plan.
So our plan's 1,403 pages long on this one. I think Cumberland's was 1,497 pages. They only had 3 revisions, we have 4, and we have less pages.
Sometimes it all depends on how well they did their diagrams or if we ask for additional ones.
And then, I guess something that kind of intrigued me is, I see the sign-off pages on here. What is the process between TDEC and TVA to notify the counties of when things are signed off and when there's a final plan? You know, when does TDEC notify the mayor of the plan's been accepted, there's been a modification to a plan? How's that work?
Well, the EIP had the public comment period, and we addressed public comments on that, and we did have TVA post it to their website and put out a notification through their website. There's currently, I'll be honest, I think we could probably do a better job on communicating that to y'all. And I think we can do that with the EAR and going forward, let y'all know when we get the plan, notify Mayor Frank.
Yeah, just definitely the mayor. I mean, she's always good to notify us
Yeah.
on what's going on, but she certainly needs to be enlightened on what's going on. I just thought it was odd as I was looking at the sign-off pages that, you know, there's no area for the local government where that plant's located to be kind of signing off on it. But you're here and you're letting us know, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think you have a very good point, Commissioner, that we could do a better job on that. And you know, when we sign off on them, it's in the order it says we're going to. You know, there's the legal requirement for TDEC being the regulatory agency on that. But definitely giving a heads up that we've done that and communicating that better, I will take that back and do a better job.
And I heard your comments on Worthington Branch and some of the findings. I guess something I wanted to ask, does TDEC look upstream of that branch and see if there's any other things that impact it? Because many years ago there was and I'm not saying that has anything to do with it, but it kind of got me thinking about Ben's Mobile Home Park when we had an open pit sewer treatment facility there that, you know, kind of sloshed it around a little bit, then it went into the creek. So that kind of gets me to thinking, and there's some other things upstream that could impact it too.
We had TVA sampled upstream of the plant in Worthington Branch, so we would have an understanding of what the water characterization is coming through the plant. So we do have that data. But as I said, we did have the CCR constituents that popped up alongside the plant that we did not see in the same concentrations upstream, which led to the additional investigation. But we did have them go up and assess that, do the same type of benthic sampling and surface water sampling that we were doing right next to the plant and downstream of the plant as well.
And then finally, when we get to the last phase, I forget what you called it, but when you get to the last phase and TDEC says, okay, we accept the plan, TVA accepts the plan, how much does TDEC get involved with the redevelopment of the property?
We have oversight of the implementation of the corrective action. So in other words, if we decide that we're going to install have TVA install a groundwater treatment system, we're going to have them do some closure activities, whether it be closure by removal, closure in place, capping, etc. We have oversight and control of that because it still falls under our regulatory authority. But as far as determinations of what the redevelopment plan is, we do not have any oversight on that. We have determination of how we're going to clean it up, but what post cleanup use could be. The only mechanisms that we really have is if we require deed restrictions as part of the closure process. There may be some restrictions on what you can use the property for based on the impacts. The deed restriction is a mechanism that we have. But if it's say the option is we're going to have them clean, close it, and everything else, you know, at that point the redevelopment is up to the property owner. But we do have the deed restriction process.
Yeah, I'd like to. I'm not asking you to to do the oversight per se, but I would like to have TDEC's wisdom, experience of when, because I'm not sure what will go there, but when it does, the TVA or the development for economic, whatever they're called, has an idea. I'd like to get TDEC's perception on, I guess because that water permit is pretty important, and I'd like to know from TDEC's standpoint of what the requirements will be for the next entity that might locate there, on what the requirements are for that water permit. Of course, there was a meeting not too long ago about revising the water permit, renewing it, and I'm just curious how that all ties together.
Well, the NPDS meeting we spoke about that we had was for their, the administrative changes they needed to make to their permit in order to reflect the current federal rules.
Okay.
Once TVA relinquishes, at some time in the future, if they relinquish that site and they no longer are the regulated entity, of course, if there's cleanup activities that are going to go beyond ownership of the property, TVA is still responsible for that, as they are the ones who are, what we call the responsible party in those type of situations. But that permit would have to be under someone, whoever took over the property, right? If somebody was going to put in a new facility that required an NPDS permit or a stormwater permit or an air permit, that becomes a new regulated entity according to the state. And Pat,
Yeah, I would think more likely that the existing NPDS permit would be terminated when they, wrapped up and sold off the land, and then when the new entity came in, acquired the land and did whatever it was that they were going to do, they would have to put a permit in place for whatever activity they were going to undertake on the site.
So it'd be a brand new permit.
That would be my expectation. I'm not a water guy,
Yeah.
but that would be my expectation.
It takes quite a while to get a new permit, though. It's like 5 to 7 years or something, or?
Not for an NPDS,
not
I
for
don't
an
think.
NPDS permit. It's really about finishing the application process, the fees associated with it, and then our Division of Water Resources, their folks review it and make sure it complies with the Federal Clean Water Act. So.
But then I got one stupid question. Sorry, I said that was my last one, but it intrigues me how TDEC self rule. I'm using the wrong terms. You guys probably have there. I guess what I'm trying to understand is EPA does not participate in Tennessee because TDEC does their own business. Is that right? I'm saying it wrong, but go ahead.
I know what you're saying, but that varies program to program. There are programs within TDEC that we actually implement under the authority of EPA, and they can overfile and they can change our direction. There are some programs where EPA has given us the authority to handle their own program. So that's pretty variable. If you can give me a media or a program, I can tell you maybe how that's handled. But that's handled different program by program.
And is that negotiated by the state of Tennessee and EPA?
No, that's basically flows down from the federal statutes through EPA. If it's a program that is retained by EPA, but they don't have the resources, say, to implement the program, then they will put an agreement in place with TDEC. Generally, they will give us grant funding as well for us to implement the program for them. That's really a resource issue, but it's still owned by EPA. And if EPA does something or if TDEC rather does something that EPA says, that's not consistent with federal rules, that ends poorly for us. So we really try hard not to let that happen. But there are other programs where it's called a delegated program, where EPA delegates it to TDEC and we just do it for them. And as long as we stay within the boundaries of the program delegation, we're fine. We get outside of those boundaries, we're in trouble, and we risk losing the program.
I was just curious from a state and federal standpoint, if the state's providing these services through TDEC, then what compensation does the state get for those services? And I think what I heard you say is there may be some grants given from time to time, and perhaps that's what's used to fund some of TDEC's operations. Is that right?
Yeah, so let me give you some specific examples that mercifully have nothing to do with TVA. So their EPA has what's called a hazardous waste program, where there's all this hazardous waste that is generated in various places. And that program is owned by EPA. And TDEC receives a grant from EPA to actually go out, do the inspections, and do, citations where appropriate, handle the permitting, and do all of that for EPA. And EPA has a few people, so they'll come in behind us, spot check us, and if everything seems to be running fine, no harm, no foul, everything goes fine. Flip side is the solid waste program, which is what the local landfills are all about. That's a delegated program. So EPA isn't actively involved in that. That's all handled by TDEC. We don't get any funding from EPA for that. We have to create our own funding mechanism. So there are things like permit fees, inspection fees, tip fees, things like that that generate the funding that we need to run the program. Does that make any sense?
That makes perfect. I'm not going to say it makes sense. I understand what you're saying.
I'll settle for that.
Thank you.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's it. That's it, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir. Did you have any questions? No? Robert, did you have any further? Mr. Lee?
Well, no, just one of the things that I know Commissioner Steve over there is going to bring some stuff up in our operations about stormwater and some things, and with TDEC here, I didn't know if you had the opportunity, if you wanted to ask him a question about that.
Nothing?
No, I think it's clear, very exhaustive. Thank you.
As long as we're exhausted, not exhausting. We try to balance that as much as we can.
Well, Commissioner, do you have any questions, or?
Yeah, just real quick.
I had a feeling you must.
So when you submit the corrective action plan, when you submit it, and you give TVA their corrective action plan, how long is the process for them to complete said plan?
It really depends on what the level of effort is going to be for the closure process and for the remedial process, right? It's very site specific. I give an example of we're currently implementing a closure process in Memphis, Tennessee at the Allen site. We are doing a complete closure by removal on that site. We're taking all of the ash out of the ponds, very smaller area than what we're doing with the Bull Run. We've got about 3.5 million cubic yards. We're removing all of that ash and we're taking it to an off-site landfill. That's going to take about 6 or 7 years to complete that removal process. The groundwater is very impacted at that site. We have really serious groundwater concerns at that site, and we're having to install a groundwater treatment system. In fact, it's up and running as of next week, I think, is the official start date of it. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
That's going to be up and running. Now that treatment system, is going to run the entire time that we're clean closing the site to treat the groundwater while we're doing that. And after closure, we will have to continue to treat the groundwater until we reach our regulatory levels, which could be 20 years of treatment process there. If we don't do any additional steps, in situ injections, things like that. So that site could be in groundwater treatment for up to 20 plus years. But the closure process, just to remove all that material and get it into a landfill, right now we're a little over a year into the process, and we've got about 6 more to go.
Couple of things. On that Allen plant, though, they burn tires too, besides just coal. And I think that probably impacted the CCRs with other elements. And then they also used it as a flood mitigation landfill material versus storing in a landfill per se. They got approval back in the late 80s, early 90s to use it as flood mitigation along the river there. So I don't know what's being mined over there now. Is it the old flood area where they used it for structural fill, or are they doing both?
No, it's the actual ponds that they discharged into. They had two surface impoundments there, two ponds, the West Ash Pond and the East Ash Pond. Both of those were removing. They did beneficially use some of that material in the Army Corps dike that is adjacent to the ponds, and the Army Corps is not letting them stick that up, at least not yet. The Army Corps is very sensitive about flood control.
I was curious about that.
But we are removing all of the material that was solution into the ponds, and like I said, it's 3.5 million cubic yards that sit in those two ponds.
Thank you, Robert.
How did that come about?
With regards to the removal,
Well, how did Memphis come to put their stuff in those locations?
well, that plant was built in the 1950s, and it was first a Memphis light and gas plant, MLGW, light, gas, and water. It was their facility. It was a coal burning plant, and it was located there along the banks of McKellar Lake, adjacent to the Mississippi River. And it provided power. I think TVA took it over about 10 or 15 years later, and they continued to provide power there. It was just the location that they chose. They did have access to the Mississippi River to get coal brought in and things like that for that particular location. But it was the West Tennessee power generating facility for a very long time. It predated Johnsonville and some of those other facilities that provided power to Western Tennessee. They did build a new natural gas plant there and shut the coal plant down in 2018. So they haven't been in operation since 2018. And the material was sluiced into those units based, first off, MLGW had those ponds and sluiced that material. And then the beneficial reuse of that material was something that was done in a time when, it was allowed to be done, right? You could take that coal ash material and beneficially reuse it, and it was a source right next to where the Army Corps wanted to build a flood protection levee.
How special. Well, Mr. Chairman, did you have anything that you wanted to?
No, thank you for being here. Appreciate the information.
Mayor?
Oh, I'm good, thank you.
Well, does anybody else have any questions or that they would like asked? Seeing none, thank you very much. Mr. Wilkinson and Mr. Flood, really appreciate you being here today. And I certainly hope we will see you again very soon.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Happy to come back.
Thank you.
Pardon?
I said we're happy to come back.
Well, you've always been very gracious about doing so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any other issues that need to be brought up during this meeting? Yes, Mr.
Yep. Chairman, I'd like to, I don't know where we have it at, if it's, I don't know if it's on, I don't know, Commissioner doesn't know if it's on operations at any point, but I would like to get feedback on American Nuclear. So you're not, you don't have it on your stuff in operations?
Not. No, it's all been coming out of Intergovernmental.
Madam Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we place American Nuclear update as the next item to be updated from TDEC.
All right.
That's my motion.
We have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any comments? All in favor? Any opposed? Thank you. Anything else? Hearing none, we are adjourned.